So, welcome everyone to what is essentially the first video on this channel. And if you're wondering why I'm only making a YouTube video this late in the game, it's because I'm not really a YouTuber. Videos have not really been my thing. I've always been more about written content and, in-depth kind of articles and research. So, some of you may have heard of my website, the Burning Blogger of Bedlam, and some of you may have been readers or subscribers. Most of you probably were not, but the reason I'm making a tentative move at this point onto YouTube is because, well, WordPress shut down my site a few weeks ago. That's right. So I've been swept up in, I guess, the censorship purge, it seems. And so that's what I want to talk about in this video. So WordPress shut down the Burning Blogger of Bedlam about a month ago, and a website, a vast archive that had been running for about 7 years was suddenly no more, and that was that. Like Thanos clicking his finger and erasing people from existence. The thought police had clicked their own godlike fingers, and hundreds of pages of research, articles, and content were gone without warning and without any real right of reply. So, firstly, I'm over it. I'm over it. I mean, I was pissed for like a day or two, but then the new Avengers movie came out and I used it as therapy and let go of my frustration, deciding to focus on future options instead and what my future possibilities are. A lot of people have gotten in touch asking me what they can do or where they can protest or complain, and while I greatly appreciate those sentiments and that support, it would probably be pointless. As far as the powers that be are concerned, it would fall on deaf ears at this point. I mean, for the record, I am establishing a new site where I'll continue to do the same research and the same written work that I've been doing for these past 7 years. But while the technical arrangements are being made for that new site, I really wanted to just talk about this somewhat Orwellian business of shutting down people's work and silencing independent voices and essentially purging significant parts of the internet of certain types of writers and of certain types of content. WordPress had the right to terminate my site. It was in the small print all along, so it was always a possibility. Ironically, I had already published an article several months earlier predicting that my site would be shut down as part of a censorship purge. And though my site currently isn't online, obviously, a version of that article can still be read in a few places where it's been republished or reblogged by other bloggers and other writers. And I'll include a link down below to one of those so that you can read it if you want to. But one thing I highlighted back then in that article is that WordPress's censorship purge seemed to have originated with an article in the New York Times in which it specifically condemned WordPress for allowing, and I quote, conspiracy theorists to keep their content on its platform. In this instance, they were specifically focusing on the Sandy Hook business, but of course there is a broader implication beyond just that specific subject. So the New York Times piece in question was titled "This Company Keeps Lies About Sandy Hook on the Web," and they were talking about WordPress, of course. And that piece went out of its way to demonize WordPress for its lack of censorship. And so, as I wrote then in that article, that's Sandy Hook today, but tomorrow it could be something else, 9/11 perhaps, because it seems odd to me that Sandy Hook would be the only issue, and that other conspiracy theory claims about other events would go unpenalized or unpunished. For the record, anyway, I've never written about Sandy Hook, so that couldn't have been the reason for my site being taken down. The Burning Blogger of Bedlam wasn't necessarily the biggest blog of its kind, but I had a pretty good-sized readership and a lot of subscribers, which had been built up, of course, over 7 years of meticulous research and a commitment to writing honest articles, and a number of my articles were republished elsewhere, including places like 21st Century Wire and SOT.net. So, what actually happened? How did this go down? Well, for a while, it seemed as if nothing was really wrong. As a WordPress blogger for some 7 or 8 years, I simply did what I usually did. I logged into my dashboard, I hit new post, and I began writing my latest article. And this article was something I'd been researching and writing for around 2 weeks. And when I logged in, nothing was wrong. I got no notifications other than the standard ones telling me that my stats were looking good and all that kind of stuff. And I proceeded to work on the article inside the editor, and I was at it for almost 4 hours, editing and re-editing and getting images and fine-tuning, etc. And then when I was satisfied, I hit publish, only to then be told that I no longer had permission to publish, and that my account, the Burning Blogger of Bedlam, had been suspended. I mean, they could have notified me of the deplatforming the moment I logged in, but they didn't. They could have sent me an email, but they didn't. Instead I spent hours, like 4 hours, working painstakingly, only to then be told that I no longer had permission to publish. I requested to know what my violation had been, and I was told by the community guardians that they were under no obligation to specify. Community guardians. How Orwellian does that sound, anyway? But here's the thing, anyway. The takedown of my site didn't occur in isolation. WordPress has been removing sites for some months. The first I was aware of it being the American Everyman blog, a site that covered many of the same subjects as mine, and I was a subscriber to that blog and a reader of that site. And when it was simply gone one day, I in fact published an article on my site about the censorship escalation and the likelihood that the Burning Blogger of Bedlam would also be taken down. So I knew it was probably coming. In his article on this takedown of the Burning Blogger of Bedlam, Mark from truthscoop.net talks about alternative voices now basically getting swatted like flies. And those are his words. The author of the American Everyman site was understandably furious at the time that his site was shut down. He suggested that his site had been on a hit list of sites that WordPress had been directed to remove from their platform. And I suspect that he was right, and that my site, the Burning Blogger of Bedlam, was on that list too. Another WordPress blogger, a friend of mine, informed me that another popular blog that would loosely fall into the same alternative media kind of category, and that was John Rappaport's blog, had also disappeared from the web at the same time as my site had disappeared. So Rappaport is a long time and prolific writer with a big following. But I've checked again, and if Rappaport's site was taken down on May the 11th, which is what he says, then this would have been about 3 days after mine went down. So clearly this was a coordinated action targeting more than one site and author, which is the platform's right. WordPress is under no obligation to continue hosting authors or content that it decides are putting out information or ideas that are contrary to the company's ideals or politics. But nevertheless, this does change things. It changes the perceived parameters of what is allowed on popular platforms. For 7 or 8 years, they didn't seem to have a problem with my content. Also worth mentioning that my site didn't just cover so-called, controversial topics. A large amount of my archive consisted of, light-hearted kind of content on music and film and comic books and other stuff that I enjoy. So it wasn't a typical conspiracy theory website. In fact, I've never really considered it conspiracy literature anyway, but more kind of independent research and journalism. As far as the so-called community guardians are concerned, something has clearly changed more recently, and my suspicion is that WordPress was being pushed by some external entity to, clean up its platform or to purge its platform, like, inconvenient writers or inconvenient content. So, what could my violation have been? Well, there was nothing on my website that would qualify as, for example, hate speech. Nothing that would qualify as racism or sexism or any other kind of prejudice, for example. There wouldn't be, because I don't have any of those views or biases anyway. And in fact, much of my content over the years has been specifically about countering or debunking those who do have those views or who do spread those views. I didn't really do extremes. So, there wasn't really any extreme content or anything like that. And I was always pretty balanced and measured for the most part. I have some background in print journalism, so I applied some of that experience and restraint to the way I presented information on my site and to the way I handled content. So I'm pretty sure the reason the community guardians told me they were under no obligation to specify my violations is because there was nothing they could easily flag me up on. At least, nothing that wouldn't simply sound like blatant censorship. If they could have flagged me up on something more concrete, say some kind of hate speech or racism or anti-Semitism or homophobia or something like that, they would have specified it. Instead, it had to be kept vague because the problem with the content was more about the information being put out and the perspective, rather than anything else. And they don't want to outright say that they're censoring information. So it's easier to just say that they have reasons, in quote marks, they have reasons, but to not specify what those reasons are. If I had to guess, my suspicion is that it's all the articles on false flag terror attacks that did it, probably. I had a pretty vast archive of articles on that subject, which I'd been covering for 5 or 6 years, and that stuff was probably the problem. In his article on WordPress's takedown of the Burning Blogger of Bedlam, Mark from truthscoop.net specifies this as the probable reason for the purge, noting that my site was one of the very few still meticulously covering false flag attacks in a forensic and non-partisan kind of manner. And for example, my comprehensive piece on the 7/7 London terror attacks was averaging a couple of hundred views a month, sometimes even a week, and that article was 4 years old at this point. In fact, after some of the other takedowns several months ago, when other sites started going missing, I had briefly thought about quietly removing all of the specific false flag terror pieces from over the years from my archive. Um, I guess to protect myself, but then I opted against it because it just felt like such a weak, submissive thing to do. What's baffling is that there is so much BS out there on the web, in the so-called alternative media, stuff that clearly falls under hate speech, or stuff that's clearly engaged in stuff like race war rhetoric or religious hatred or open sexism or homophobia, etc. And so much of it stays up, which it should, because I believe in free speech, even though I despise most of that stuff. But there are balanced, reasonable authors and content producers who put out well-researched, high-quality content, and who seem to get caught up in this censorship too, as if everyone is being tarred with the same brush. I was speaking on Skype with Mark from TruthScoop a week ago, and in his opinion, they're actually specifically targeting the more balanced, grown-up kind of writers, and whose archives contain substantial bodies of research and balanced, non-biased analysis, while allowing the more ridiculous, cartoony kind of conspiracy theory caricature type characters, or alt-right alt-right style propagandists and BS peddlers to stay online. James, who writes the brilliant Crimes of Empire website, uh, expressed to me in an email how baffled he was that my site in particular had been taken down by WordPress, saying that he couldn't imagine what there was on my site that anyone could have really had a problem with, and that he found it completely bewildering. As one commenter on the Truth Scoop article says, so much of the alternative media is actually controlled opposition bullshit, and this is true. Uh, and taking note of which so-called alternative media voices are being censored and which ones are being allowed to flourish is an indicator of which ones are controlled opposition and which ones are not, you would have to think. Of course, a lot of the channels on YouTube or things that have been banned on Facebook or wherever else have been deplatformed because they were clearly producing hate speech, or they were offensive in some obvious way. Whereas I think what's being cleverly done really is that while all these other blanket kind of bans are going on targeting those kinds of people, they're very cleverly kind of also sweeping up targets who don't fall into that category, like American Everyman or like myself, but making it look like it's all part of the same sweep. It's all part of the same purge, and that we're all part of the same problem, even though we're completely different. Unnecessary News from Earth has also written a passionate piece about the Burning Blogger of Bedlam being taken down, and one of his commenters, another WordPress blogger as it happens, puts it in these terms, writing that if the only reason you are being shut down is for uttering the truth about something, you really ought to be patting yourself on the back. Well, yes and no. If we even remove my own content from this equation and just talk about someone like American Everyman or John Rappaport, those are both examples of well-written, well-researched, and intelligently argued content producers who aren't rabid hate mongers or propagandists, but who have both also been deplatformed by WordPress, just like I was. It's clear then that this has nothing to do with political correctness or social or political values, but is purely about information and perspective. In those two examples, and my own, they were clearly targeting sites or authors that were forwarding a certain type of perspective and putting out certain types of information in a balanced and reasoned way. And again, WordPress has the right to remove things from its platform, just like Facebook does or YouTube does. But it's worth noting what they're removing and why, or at least asking why. It's difficult to see it as anything other than shutting down certain perspectives, and this is presumably something that is going to be happening or is already happening across other platforms too. There have been purges on YouTube as well as on Facebook and elsewhere. Sometimes it's been somewhat justified, and a lot of the time it isn't. And a lot of the time, it's done so quietly and without fanfare that most people don't even notice. But we have to, with all of this in mind, we have to then wonder what the internet is going to look like in a few years' time, as far as diversity of perspective or plurality of information sources is concerned. Because one very palpable danger is that what we end up with and what they want is an entirely binary dynamic, whereby you have the so-called respectable mainstream media news/analysis platforms on one side, and you have the rabid crackpot conspiracy or so-called alternative media on the other side, and with all of the intelligent, balanced middle ground removed completely from the equation. In that scenario, people in general will only have one extreme or the other to go to. You're either with the mainstream or you're with the crackpots, and there is no reasonable, balanced perspective or journalism in the middle. That makes it harder for people to form reasoned, balanced views, and it also makes it easier for people to be divided into easy labels based on their web history or reading material, or based on which of the two echo chambers they reside in. It means too that people are more liable to be indoctrinated entirely by either the extreme crackpot side or by the mainstream media side. And when I say mainstream media in this context, I mean corporate media, corporate controlled media. All of this being said, I'm lucky, as I have a friend slash supporter helping me out to establish a new platform, a new website, and he's handling the tech side of things for me. Um, and I should be up and running again in a few weeks. But a lot of people in my situation would find themselves at a total loss, potentially having lost 7 years worth of research and content. In that situation, they might find themselves feeling that the whole thing is just futile and they might just give up. They might also not have the resources to spend money on establishing a more secure foundation for continuing their work. And if the situation now is that there are no free platforms, as in you have to spend money in order to have a voice, because you'll get kicked off of the free platforms if you stray from what's deemed acceptable, then the quality of discourse and debate is going to go downhill. Like I said, I'll be up and running again in a while with a new site. But I had genuinely thought about just quitting, just letting this side of things go and just focusing on other things. After all, it's not the happiest thing in the world spending hours working on content that that usually isn't very cheerful or inspiring in nature, particularly when much of it is contentious and particularly when you're not profiting anything from it, really. But I don't want to be a quitter, and I received some really positive messages from people via email or elsewhere expressing their dismay or anger at what WordPress had done and urging me to carry on doing what I was doing somehow or another. So that's basically what I am going to do. But I do wonder how many voices have been or will be silenced permanently, disappearing in the middle of the night with barely anyone noticing that they were gone or that they were even there at all in the first place. In his article on WordPress's takedown of the Burning Blogger of Bedlam, the Unnecessary News from Earth site writes the following. Freedom of speech has a linear connection with freedom of thought and freedom of the press. If you eliminate one of them, you will have a set of dots that won't unite forever. If you want your ideas to be free, you need freedom of expression, and for progressing of your freedom of expression, you need freedom of the press. Global press companies have many subsidiaries and affiliates in their business units. Even their numbers are beyond measure, so there's almost a single voice on the planet, literally. Those who break this singularity, that is, those who sail into the storm, are of course present. There are freelance journalists, and there are also bloggers, he says. But for how much longer? I mean, the way things are going. One day, the American Everyman site disappears from the web. Another day, and the Burning Blogger of Bedlam is gone. And at the same time, John Rappaport's site gets taken down. In a few weeks, it might be a bunch of other voices being quietly and suddenly silenced. Eventually, there's no one left. That is, apart from A, the corporate-controlled mainstream media, and B, the fake, controlled opposition aspects of so-called alternative media, and that's it. That's your lot. And isn't that going to be fun? Maybe that's the point, to just discourage us and, to make us stop. Or, as I said earlier, to just start chipping away at the diversity of perspectives and the plurality of information sources. Anyway, thanks for listening, or thanks for watching. There is going to be a new website, like I said, and I think I will try to make some more videos on here, if I can, if I can bear the sound of my own voice. You can support me by subscribing to this channel, and in more general terms, please do continue to support independent journalism, honest research, and Well, freedom of speech.